The first sign that something had gone wrong came not from any radar system, satellite feed, or intelligence report. It came from silence. One moment, an entire forward combat unit of dispatch soldiers, 12 operators, 2 armored vehicles, and 1 Class A enhanced asset were transmitting live from the industrial outskirts of New Markov City, their comms busy with the controlled noise of a standard suppression operation. Then between one transmission and the next, every signal went dead simultaneously. Not jammed, not cut, just finished the way a sentence ends when there is simply nothing left to say. By the time Dispatch Command routed a secondary drone feed over the location, the armored vehicles were upright, undamaged, and empty. The enhanced asset, a soldier classified as functionally bulletproof, was sitting against a crumbled concrete barrier, helmet cracked down the middle, staring at his own hands with an expression no one in command had ever seen on a trained combatant before. The expression was not fear. It was the specific, hollow look of a person who had just understood, completely and without comfort, that everything they believed about power was wrong. Whatever had walked through that operation had not been a weapon. It had been something else entirely, and it was still out there. If you think you know where this story is going, you don't. Subscribe now, because what starts as a strange incident in a back alley war zone becomes something that cannot be undone. The world of Dispatch will never recover. Neither will you. Nobody at Dispatch Command could have predicted that the single most destabilizing event in the organization's operational history would begin because a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit was looking for a convenience store that sold discounted instant noodles. That was the truth of it, as best as the after-action analysts could reconstruct from available footage and witness testimony. Saitama had arrived in New Markov City the same way he arrived most places, by accident, or something close enough to accident that the distinction didn't really matter. He had been pursuing what he vaguely remembered as a lead on a monster sighting, had taken a wrong turn somewhere around the 3rd overpass, and had ended up in the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights had stopped working years ago and the buildings leaned against each other like exhausted men on a long shift. He wasn't worried. He was never worried. He was, if anything, a little hungry and mildly annoyed that the city appeared to have no visible convenience stores in this particular district. The dispatch operation already in progress was a standard tier suppression run, which in practice meant 12 soldiers moving through the industrial corridor to intercept a black market weapons transfer connected to a rival faction that Command had been tracking for the better part of 3 months. The unit was led by a field operative named Harlan Voss, a 10-year veteran with a documented history of clean extractions and 0 mission failures. Voss was the kind of man who had made peace with the violent geometry of his profession, who understood that the world worked because people like him kept it moving in the right direction through the application of controlled, precise force. He had briefed his team thoroughly. He had accounted for all known variables. The one variable he had not accounted for was a bored, slightly hungry man in a superhero costume, wandering into the middle of his operation from the East Corridor, because that direction looked like it might have a lit storefront somewhere. The first soldier to see Saitama raised his weapon immediately, which was protocol, and shouted a warning in 2 languages, which was also protocol, and then watched as Saitama turned around to look at him with the specific expression of someone who has just been interrupted while trying to remember whether they turned off the stove. Saitama looked at the rifle. He looked at the soldier. He looked back down the alley in the direction he had been walking. He said with complete sincerity that he was just passing through and asked if anyone knew where the nearest store was. The soldier did not lower his weapon. 3 more soldiers moved to flank positions. Voss, watching from 30 meters back through a tactical scope, radioed command and reported an unidentified civilian in an unusual costume at grid reference 7, requesting guidance on how to proceed. Command told him to detain and identify. Voss passed the order forward. 2 soldiers moved to physically intercept Saitama, which was when the situation changed, because the enhanced asset assigned to the unit, a man internally designated as Striker 4, whose combat augmentation program had taken 14 months and cost approximately $9 million in development funding, decided that the stranger's refusal to comply with verbal commands constituted a threat, and threw a punch designed to incapacitate an armored vehicle. The punch connected. Saitama didn't move. He looked down at the fist pressed against his cheek with the mild, puzzled expression of someone who has just been tapped on the shoulder in a library. Striker 4 had time to process this for approximately 1 second before Saitama, not out of aggression, but out of the same idle reflex a person might use to brush away a persistent insect, flicked 2 fingers against his opponent's chest. The resulting impact sent Striker 4 through a concrete wall, across a drainage channel, and into a parked armored vehicle on the far side of the corridor. The vehicle did not survive the encounter. Striker 4 did, but he would not be getting up for some time. The remaining soldiers held their positions, weapons raised, every one of them recalibrating silently and rapidly. Voss's radio transmission to command was short. He said, "Command, we have a problem." And then, because the man in the yellow jumpsuit had already turned back around and was walking calmly toward the far end of the alley, Voss added 4 more words that would eventually appear in 14 separate classified briefings across 6 government agencies. "He's not stopping. Over." The footage from Voss's unit reached Dispatch Command's Central Analysis Division at 4:17 in the morning, and by 4:32, 3 senior analysts had watched it enough times that they had stopped reacting to the impact moment and started watching the 30 seconds before it instead. That was where the real information was, they decided. Not in the wall, not in the destroyed vehicle. Not even in the way Striker 4 had gone airborne with the trajectory of something fired from a cannon, rather than struck by a human hand. The real information was in Saitama's posture during those 30 seconds, the way he stood with his hands loosely at his sides, the way his expression did not change when 12 rifles were pointed at him, the way he looked at the enhanced assets punch the way a person looks at rain, acknowledging it, not particularly concerned by it, already thinking about something else. The analysts flagged the footage as Priority Tier 1 and escalated it to Director Hargrove before 5 in the morning, which was something none of them had ever done before on their own authority, and which told Hargrove everything he needed to know about the severity of what he was about to watch before he even pressed play. Director Hargrove was not an emotional man, professionally speaking. He had spent 22 years inside organizations that dealt in controlled catastrophe, and he had developed the particular stillness of someone who has learned that reacting visibly to bad news is itself a form of bad news. He watched the footage twice without speaking. Then he asked his overnight analyst, a sharp-edged woman named Reyes, what the current classification of the incident was. Reyes told him it had been logged as an unidentified combatant encounter, standard threat flag, pending further review. Hargrove told her to remove the standard flag, assign it a black-level classification, and make sure that the only people who could access the raw footage were sitting in the room right now. He then asked where the subject was currently located. Reyes told him they didn't know. The drone feed had tracked Saitama for approximately 4 blocks after he left the corridor, at which point he had turned a corner and the drone had lost visual. He had not been found since. Hargrove was quiet for a moment, and then he said, very carefully, that he wanted every available passive surveillance asset in New Markov City looking for a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit, and that when they found him, nobody was to approach, engage, or communicate with him until Hargrove himself gave the order. He used the word nobody twice, which everyone in the room understood as a direct reference to the kind of people inside Dispatch, who sometimes felt that orders like this didn't apply to them. What Hargrove did not yet know, because the intelligence hadn't reached him, was that Saitama had already been found, not by Dispatch, but by a 3-man team operating under a rival faction called the Meridian Group, who had been running their own surveillance on the new Markov corridor for entirely different reasons, and whose field team had picked up the drone feed through a compromised relay, node approximately 6 minutes after Dispatch lost visual. The Meridian Group's analysts were less measured in their response than Hargrove's team. They watched Striker 4 go through the concrete wall, and then they watched it again, and their conclusion was not careful or methodical. Their conclusion was that Dispatch had developed and deployed a new category of enhanced combatant without warning, which meant that the existing strategic balance between their organization and Dispatch had just shifted in a direction they found unacceptable, and that the appropriate response was immediate and aggressive intelligence collection on this new asset before it could be used against them. They began moving a collection team toward Saitama's last known position within the hour. Saitama, for his part, had found a vending machine 2 streets away from the drainage channel. It was one of the older outdoor models, partially broken, dispensing items at roughly half their listed price due to a mechanical fault in the payment reader. He bought 3 cans of something that claimed to be beef stew and sat down on a low concrete barrier to eat them, watching the city begin its slow, gray early morning routine with the patient, empty contentment of someone who had nowhere particular to be. He did not notice the 2 surveillance drones now orbiting at high altitude above his position. He did not notice the black sedan that had parked at the end of the block 7 minutes ago and had not moved. He finished the first can of stew and decided it tasted mostly like salt and mild disappointment, which in his experience was about average for this kind of thing, and reached for the second one. The Meridian Group's collection team arrived at Saitama's position at 6:40 in the morning, which was 40 minutes after he had finished his vending machine breakfast, and approximately 20 minutes after he had fallen asleep sitting upright on the concrete barrier with his arms folded, and his chin dropped to his chest, in the boneless, unconcerned way of someone who has decided that the absence of a bed is not a meaningful obstacle to rest. The team leader, a compact and precise woman named Sorrel who had run 31 collection operations across 9 cities without a single casualty on either side, looked at the sleeping figure through her vehicle window for a long moment before transmitting back to Meridian Command that the target appeared to be napping in public and asking whether the original extraction parameters still applied. Command confirmed. Sorrel stepped out of the vehicle with 2 of her operatives and approached Saitama the way you approach something that looks harmless and that you have extremely good reasons not to trust. The plan was clean and professional. A fast-acting aerosol sedative deployed from close range, a physical transfer into the vehicle, and a 40-minute drive to a Meridian facility on the eastern edge of the city where their research division could begin a proper assessment. It was the kind of operation Sorrel could run in her sleep. She had done essentially the same thing 14 times with enhanced assets, twice with prototype combat units that had gone rogue, and once with a man who could generate localized electrical fields with his nervous system, and who had still gone down in under 8 seconds when the sedative hit. She positioned her team, confirmed wind direction, and deployed the aerosol directly into Saitama's face from a distance of approximately 1 meter. Saitama sneezed. Then he opened his eyes, looked at Sorrel with the slow, adjusting blink of someone interrupted mid-dream, and said that whatever she had just sprayed at him smelled like artificial lemon and old machinery. Sorrel, to her significant professional credit, did not hesitate. She stepped back, signaled her team, and 2 operatives moved to physically restrain the target using a joint lock system developed specifically for enhanced combatants, involving approximately 300 pounds of combined operative weight applied to pressure points that had been clinically demonstrated to incapacitate augmented humans within 4 seconds. Saitama looked down at the 2 men attached to his arms with the mild, slightly confused expression of someone who has just had a cat jump onto their lap uninvited. He stood up, which lifted both operatives off the ground because they hadn't released their holds, and asked Sorrel, in a tone of genuine and unhurried curiosity, what exactly was going on and whether this was some kind of hero test. What happened in the next 90 seconds was later reconstructed from Sorrell's own debrief report, because the team's body cameras had not survived the encounter in working condition. Saitama had not attacked the team. That was the part Sorrell kept returning to in her report, underlining it in two places as if she expected her superiors to miss it the first time. He had not attacked them. He had simply moved, with a casualness that made the movement more disturbing than aggression would have been, and in moving he had incidentally displaced every operative who was in contact with him, not violently but with the irreversible finality of a large, slow tide. One operative ended up seated on top of the black sedan. Another found herself deposited, gently and without apparent malice, inside a recycling container. The third was simply no longer near Saitama, having been set down approximately 15 feet to the left of where he had been standing, with no clear memory of the transition. Sorrell herself had not been touched. Saitama had looked at her afterward with an expression she described in her report as like someone who is waiting for you to explain the joke, and then asked again, sincerely, whether she was from a hero association of some kind. Sorrell's debrief transmission reached Meridian Command at 7:22. The director of Meridian Operations, a man named Calloway who had built his career on the principle that every human capability had a ceiling that could be identified and exploited, read the report twice and then called an emergency meeting of his senior staff. He told them, without preamble, that they needed to fundamentally revise their assumptions about what Dispatch had apparently developed, because the asset they were looking at did not behave like a weapon and did not respond like an augmented soldier, and did not have a ceiling that any of their current frameworks could locate. The room was quiet for a moment. Then his chief analyst said the thing everyone was already thinking, that if Dispatch had something like this and Meridian didn't, the existing operational balance wasn't just shifting. It was already gone. By 9 in the morning, New Markov City had 3 separate intelligence operations running simultaneously within its boundaries, none of which were communicating with each other, and all of which were focused on the same bald man who was currently standing outside a closed hardware store, reading a handwritten sign that said the shop wouldn't open until 10, and looking at it with the specific expression of someone doing careful arithmetic about whether waiting was worth it. Dispatch had 4 passive surveillance drones overhead and 2 plainclothes monitoring teams at street level, operating under Hargrove's standing order to observe and not engage. Meridian had pulled their collection team back after Sorrell's report and replaced them with 2 long-range observation posts on elevated positions, feeding live imagery back to Calloway's analysts. And a third organization, one that neither Dispatch nor Meridian had anticipated would become involved this quickly, had entered the picture overnight, a private intelligence contractor called Ashwick Solutions, which had been monitoring Meridian's compromised relay node for unrelated reasons, and had intercepted enough of the footage and report traffic to understand that something extraordinary was happening in their city, and that there was almost certainly someone willing to pay a significant amount of money to know more about it. The footage problem, as Hargrove's team had already begun to understand, was that it was spreading. Not publicly, not yet, but through the dense and leaky infrastructure of competing private intelligence networks. The images of Striker 4 going through the concrete wall had been copied, compressed, and transmitted at least 11 times in the past 4 hours to recipients in 4 different cities. Hargrove had ordered a containment effort on the footage distribution, but his analyst Rays had given him an honest assessment within the first hour. Full containment was unlikely. The images were already too distributed, moving through too many independent networks with too many different owners, and the people transmitting them were doing so precisely because the footage was unusual enough to be valuable. What Hargrove could control was the narrative around the footage, at least for now, at least within the channels he had direct access to. He began building a cover story, a next-generation combat prototype, a classified kinetic enhancement program, something plausible enough to redirect the assumptions of anyone who saw the imagery without access to the full context. It was good work, professionally executed, and it would last approximately 48 hours before the reality overtook it entirely. On the street below all of this surveillance architecture, Saitama had decided the hardware store wasn't worth waiting for, and had begun walking in a generally eastward direction with no particular destination in mind. He was thinking, in the unfocused and leisurely way he often thought about things, about the man who had punched him the previous night. Not about the punch itself, which had registered about as significantly as a light breeze. He was thinking about the look on the man's face afterward, that specific hollow expression the drone footage had captured so clearly, and finding in it something that he recognized from a long time ago, from a version of himself that felt distant and somewhat theoretical at this point. He had been that person once, someone who believed that enough training and enough power and enough effort would eventually produce an opponent worth the trouble. He understood, in the abstract and untroubled way that he understood most things now, that it was genuinely unfortunate for that soldier that the first time he had encountered something beyond his ceiling, it had been something as far beyond his ceiling as Saitama was. He felt mildly bad about the wall. Not very bad. Mildly. What pulled him out of this line of thinking was a sound, distant but specific. The compressed, industrial crack of a high-caliber weapon fired in an enclosed space, followed almost immediately by two more, followed by a longer silence that had a quality to it that even Saitama, who was not generally attuned to the emotional texture of urban soundscapes, recognized as the silence that follows something going very wrong. He stopped walking. He tilted his head slightly in the direction the sound had come from, the way a person does when they're not sure whether a noise requires action or whether it will resolve itself without their involvement. Then a second sound reached him, human, panicked, moving fast, and he turned to see three civilians running from the mouth of a side street approximately 40 meters away, looking back over their shoulders at something that had not yet emerged behind them but that was clearly coming. Saitama watched them run past him. He looked at the mouth of the side street. He sighed very quietly, with the tone of someone who has just remembered an errand they were hopping to avoid, and started walking toward it. Behind him, in a surveillance van parked 6 blocks away, Dispatch Monitoring Team Lead Operative Chen watched her screen with both hands flat on the console and said, to no one in particular and everyone at once, "He's moving toward the contact point. He's walking toward it. Someone get Hargrove on the line right now." What had drawn the civilians out of the side street was a Meridian strike team that had nothing to do with Saitama, at least not originally. The team had been inserted into the Eastern Commercial District before dawn to intercept a dispatch courier carrying encrypted financial routing data, which was the kind of operation that happened in New Markov City, with enough regularity that the local population had developed a practiced, efficient panic response to the sound of gunfire. Move away from the noise. Don't stop moving. Don't look back until you've turned at least 2 corners. The courier was down. 2 dispatch plainclothes agents who had been running a parallel escort operation without telling the surveillance teams about it. Because that was the kind of institutional communication failure that Hargrove had been trying to fix for 3 years, were pinned behind an overturned delivery vehicle at the far end of the street. The Meridian strike team, 6 operators in tactical gear with military-grade suppression weapons, was advancing on their position with the calm, methodical pace of people who have done the arithmetic and know how it resolves. And then Saitama turned the corner. He walked into the middle of the street, hands in his pockets, and looked at the scene in front of him with the patient, assessing expression of someone who has arrived at a situation they don't fully understand and is taking a moment to establish the basic facts before deciding what, if anything, to do about them. 2 people behind a wrecked vehicle, 6 armed people moving toward them, gunfire, smoke, broken glass across the pavement. He processed this in approximately 2 seconds and arrived at a working conclusion that was characteristically simple. The 6 people with guns appeared to be the problem. The 2 people behind the vehicle appeared to be the people having the problem, and resolving the situation would probably not take very long. He started walking toward the 6 operators. The Meridian team leader, a veteran named Drax who had survived 14 direct engagements, and who had the specific, finely calibrated threat assessment instincts that come from that kind of experience, saw Saitama coming and made an immediate and professionally reasonable decision. He ordered 2 of his operators to redirect and cover the new arrival, identified him as a non-tactical civilian based on his clothing and his casual movement pattern, and prepared a verbal warning. The warning was delivered. Saitama didn't stop walking. A second warning was delivered, louder, with a weapon raised. Saitama looked at the raised weapon with the same mild curiosity he had given to every weapon that had been pointed at him in the past 18 hours, and kept walking. Drax, operating entirely within the logic of every professional framework he had ever been trained in, gave the order to fire. 2 operators discharged their weapons at Saitama from a distance of approximately 12 meters. The rounds hit. This was confirmed later by the physical evidence recovered from the scene. The rounds made contact and achieved nothing at all, in the same way that throwing stones at a moving building would achieve nothing at all, and Saitama's response to being shot was to briefly look down at his jumpsuit to see if there was any visible damage, find none, and continue walking. Drax had perhaps 1 full second to recalibrate before Saitama reached the nearest operator, and in that second he transmitted a single word back to Meridian Command, a word that was not a tactical report or a status update but simply an involuntary expression of what his instincts were telling him, which was that the thing walking toward his team was not something his team was equipped to handle. The word was abort. He said it once clearly, and then Saitama was among them. He didn't use his full strength. There was no reason to. He moved through the 6 operators the way a person moves through a crowded room when they have somewhere to be, efficient, unhurried, contact brief and conclusive. The first operator was redirected sideways into a storefront awning with enough force to bring the entire frame down. The second was lifted and set down on a fire escape 8 feet above street level, where he gripped the railing and stayed very still. The third, fourth, and fifth went down in a sequence so rapid that the 2 dispatch agents behind the vehicle, watching through a gap in the overturned delivery truck, could not reconstruct the individual moments afterward, only the general shape of what had happened, which was that 5 trained operators had ceased to be a functioning unit in under 4 seconds. Drax was last. Saitama looked at him for a moment and then simply tapped him once with an open palm against the center of his chest, and Drax sat down hard against the wall behind him and stayed there, breathing, unhurt in any serious way, staring at Saitama with an expression that Sorrel, had she been present, would have immediately recognized. The 2 dispatch agents emerged from behind the vehicle slowly, weapons half raised, looking at Saitama the way you look at something that has just done you an enormous favor and that you are not at all sure is safe to thank. Saitama looked back at them. He asked, in his usual tone of mild and honest inquiry, whether either of them knew a good place to get lunch around here, because he had been in the city for almost a full day and had only managed vending machine food so far and was starting to find that genuinely frustrating. The 2 dispatch agents, whose names were Keller and Park, and who had been doing this job long enough to know that the correct response to an inexplicable situation was to keep the inexplicable thing talking until someone with more authority arrived, did the only professionally sensible thing available to them. They told Saitama there was a decent noodle place 2 blocks north, walked him there, sat down across from him at a small table near the window, and spent 45 minutes having the most operationally surreal debrief of their careers. Saitama ate 2 large bowls of ramen and answered their questions with complete honesty and zero awareness that his answers were the most classified information either of them had ever been in physical proximity to. He told them he was a hero. He explained, with the patient clarity of someone describing a hobby that most people don't fully appreciate, that he had trained very hard for a long time and had gotten quite strong as a result, though he acknowledged with a kind of resigned honesty that strong was probably underselling it at this point. He told them he had come to the city following what turned out to be a false lead on a monster sighting, that he had gotten lost, that he was not affiliated with any military organization or government program, and that the suit was just something he wore. Keller and Park transmitted a live audio feed of the entire conversation back to Hargrove, who listened to it in his office with Reyes standing beside him, and the expression of a man who is watching a structural wall develop a crack and trying to decide whether it is the kind of crack that spreads or the kind that stops. By the time Saitama finished his second bowl of ramen, Hargrove had made his decision. It was not a decision he had arrived at casually or without significant internal resistance, because the decision required him to accept a set of premises that his professional framework had no comfortable place for. The premises were these: the individual currently eating noodles 2 blocks from an active Meridian strike site was not a prototype, not an augmented asset, not a classified program belonging to any organization Dispatch had records on, and not something that could be explained by any enhancement methodology currently known to exist. He was, as far as Hargrove's analysts could determine from the footage, the debrief audio, and the physical evidence recovered from 2 separate incident sites, simply a man who was stronger than anything the current world had produced a framework for measuring. And he appeared to have no agenda, no allegiance, no tactical objective, and no particular awareness that his presence in New Markov City had already restructured the operational landscape of 3 competing intelligence organizations before lunchtime. The decision Hargrove made was to recruit him, not through force, not through deception, and not through the kind of institutional pressure that Dispatch typically applied to assets it wanted to bring inside its operational structure. Those approaches had implicit assumptions built into them, assumptions about leverage, about vulnerability, about the existence of some ceiling of capability above which a target could be pressured. Every piece of evidence Hargrove had suggested that none of those assumptions applied here. The only approach that made logical sense, given what he was looking at, was honest and direct communication, which was an approach Hargrove had not used in a recruitment context in approximately 11 years, and which felt strange in his mouth when he rehearsed it. He told Reyes to have Keller and Park bring Saitama in for a voluntary meeting. He told her to use the word voluntary twice, and to make absolutely certain it was understood as genuine. He then spent 20 minutes preparing what he intended to say, which was unusual for him, because Hargrove was not a man who normally needed to prepare for conversations with people he outranked, out-resourced, and outmaneuvered in every conventional strategic dimension. He was preparing now because he understood, in the clear and unsparing way that good intelligence directors understand things they would prefer not to, that he did not outmaneuver Saitama in any dimension that currently mattered. Saitama agreed to the meeting without hesitation, which Keller reported back to Hargrove with an audible note of surprise in his voice, because, in Keller's experience, people who could do what Saitama could do did not typically agree to voluntary meetings with intelligence organizations. Hargrove was not surprised. He had already concluded that Saitama's cooperation was not a strategic calculation on Saitama's part. It was simpler than that. Saitama had agreed because he had nothing else scheduled for the afternoon, and the meeting sounded like it might at least be interesting, which in his experience was a higher standard than most things he was offered on a given day. He followed Keller and Park to the dispatch facility on the north side of the city, hands in his pockets, looking at the buildings with the mild, unhurried attention of a tourist, while above him 4 surveillance drones adjusted their formation to maintain visual coverage, and 3 separate intelligence organizations held their breath and waited to see what happened when the most dangerous thing in New Markov City walked voluntarily through a door. The dispatch facility on the north side of New Markov City was not the kind of building that announced itself. It occupied the upper 4 floors of what appeared from the street to be a mid-tier logistics company, with the appropriate signage and the appropriate volume of unremarkable foot traffic moving in and out of the ground floor entrance to maintain the appearance. The real infrastructure was above that: reinforced floors, signal-dampened walls, a server architecture that Hargrove's technology division had spent 4 years building to a specification that made it, in theory, impenetrable to the kind of surveillance tools that Meridian and Ashwick Solutions were currently pointing at the building's exterior. Saitama looked at the lobby with the same expression he gave most interiors, which was the expression of someone cataloging the general dimensions of a space without finding anything in it particularly remarkable. He noted that the ceiling was low, the lighting was fluorescent, and that it smelled like most office buildings, which was to say like recycled air and the accumulated residue of too many people spending too many hours in close proximity to each other. He followed Keller and Park into an elevator without comment. Hargrove met him on the 4th floor, in a room that had been chosen with care, large enough not to feel like an interrogation space, furnished with the specific, neutral comfort of a place designed to make people feel that the organization hosting them was reasonable and approachable, with a table and chairs, and a window that showed a managed slice of the city skyline. Hargrove stood when Saitama entered, which was a deliberate choice, and extended his hand, which Saitama shook with the automatic politeness of someone who has been taught that handshakes are the appropriate response to extended hands, and who has not yet found a reason to revise that position. Hargrove introduced himself by name and title. Saitama introduced himself by name, and then, after a brief pause, added that he was a hero for fun, which he said with the same flat, factual tone he used for everything, and which produced a silence in the room that Reyes, seated to Hargrove's left with a recording device and a notepad, would later describe in her personal log as the most complete silence she had ever experienced in a professional setting. Hargrove, to his considerable credit, did not let the silence extend. He told Saitama directly that Dispatch was aware of the 2 incidents from the previous night and morning, that they had reviewed the available footage, and that they were not here to threaten or detain him. He said they had questions, and that answering those questions was entirely at Saitama's discretion, but that the answers mattered in ways that extended well beyond the immediate situation in New Markov City. Saitama listened to this with his hands on the table, and his expression attentive in the surface way that people are attentive when they are following the words being said to them without fully engaging with the implications behind the words. He said that was fine, that he didn't mind questions, and asked whether there was any coffee available because the noodles had been good, but he was starting to feel the early afternoon drop. Someone left the room and came back with coffee. Saitama drank it and waited. The questions Hargrove asked were precise and professionally structured, moving from general to specific, in a sequence designed to establish baseline information before probing the details that actually mattered. How long had Saitama been operating at his current capability level? Whether he had any organizational affiliation, any chain of command, any external direction governing his movements and decisions, whether he was aware of anyone else operating at a comparable level, whether he had limitations, physical, circumstantial, environmental, that were not apparent from observation. Saitama answered each question honestly and completely, and each answer produced, in Hargrove and Reyes and the 3 analysts watching through the one-way glass at the side of the room, a version of the same internal recalibration that everyone who had encountered Saitama in the past 24 hours had been forced to perform. He had been at this level for approximately 3 years. He had no organizational affiliation. He was not aware of anyone else operating comparably. And regarding limitations, he paused here, not because he was being evasive, but because he was genuinely thinking about it, in the honest and effortful way of someone trying to give an accurate answer to a question they had not previously considered in formal terms, and then said that he couldn't think of any, really, and that this was in its own way not entirely a good thing, and left it at that. The analyst behind the one-way glass, a former military scientist named Dr. Orrin Vask, who had spent 12 years studying enhanced human capability, and who had believed, until approximately 40 seconds ago, that he had a working model of the outer boundary of what human physiology could theoretically achieve, put his pen down on his notepad, and did not pick it up again for a long time. He was not writing notes. He was doing the thing that scientists do when a data point arrives that does not fit inside any existing model, which is stare at it and try to find the error, and gradually understand that the error is not in the data. Dr. Orrin Vask spent the remainder of that afternoon and most of the following night writing a report that he revised 11 times before submitting it to Hargrove at 6:15 the next morning. The revisions were not stylistic. Each one represented a moment where Vask had written something, read it back, and understood that the language he had used still contained implicit assumptions that the evidence did not support, words like ceiling and threshold and physiological limit, that smuggled in the premise that there was a boundary somewhere, that the data was simply pointing toward a boundary they hadn't located yet rather than suggesting, as Vask increasingly and uncomfortably believed it was suggesting, that there was no boundary to locate. The final version of the report was the most carefully worded document Vask had produced in his professional life, and it said, in the precise and hedged language of a scientist who understands that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and who has the extraordinary evidence sitting in a recorded interview on the floor above him, that the subject designated Saitama represented a category of physical capability that could not be accounted for by any known biological, genetic, or enhancement-based framework, that all existing models of human performance were insufficient to describe what the available data showed, and that the operational implications of this were, in Vask's assessment, severe and immediate. Hargrove read the report once, set it down, and asked Vask directly what he meant by severe and immediate. Vask told him. He said that every strategic calculation Dispatch made, every mission plan, every threat assessment, every deployment decision was built on a shared foundational assumption, which was that the most capable individual actor in any given situation operated within a range of power that the organization's resources could, in principle, address. That assumption was load-bearing. The entire architecture of how Dispatch operated, how it negotiated with rival organizations, how it assessed risk and allocated response, depended on that assumption being true. What Vask's report was telling him was that the assumption was no longer true, not approximately true, not true with exceptions. Simply no longer true, in the presence of this one individual whose capabilities Vask could not measure, could not model, and could not predict an upper boundary for, because every instrument and methodology he had available to him had been designed in a world where that assumption held. He said all of this in the flat, precise tone of a scientist delivering findings, without drama, and the flatness of it made it more difficult to hear than drama would have been. What neither Hargrove nor Vask knew while this conversation was happening was that Vask's report, or rather, a summary of its conclusions, stripped of its careful hedging and reduced to its most operationally alarming elements, had already left the building. Not through any failure of Dispatch's security architecture, which was functioning as designed. It had left through Reyes, who was not a traitor in any simple or satisfying sense of the word, but who had been passing selected information to Ashwick Solutions for 14 months in exchange for financial arrangements that had seemed manageable at the time, and that she now understood, with the specific clarity of someone watching a situation accelerate past the point where they can control it, were not manageable at all. She had not intended to pass this particular information. She had passed it because Ashwick's handler had contacted her at 2 in the morning with a pressure level she hadn't experienced before, and because the situation had moved so quickly that she had not had time to calculate the consequences with her usual care. The summary she passed was 6 sentences long. It was enough. Ashwick Solutions delivered a condensed version of those 6 sentences to 4 separate clients within 3 hours of receiving them, each client representing a different faction with different resources and different threat responses, and a shared, immediate conclusion that what was sitting inside the dispatch facility in New Markov City was not a dispatch asset at all, was not anyone's asset, was not controllable by dispatch or anyone else, and that the organization currently hosting it had approximately no more real advantage over it than everyone else did, which meant that the strategic calculation everyone had been running since the first footage appeared, the calculation that assumed dispatch had something and everyone else needed to respond to dispatch having something, was wrong. The correct calculation, the one that began circulating through 4 different organizational command structures simultaneously before 8 in the morning, was simpler and more destabilizing. Nobody had him. Nobody controlled him. And he was still in the building, drinking coffee and asking Keller whether New Markov City had any kind of hero registration program he should know about, because he had been operating without one for a while and wasn't sure if that was technically a problem. Calloway, receiving the Ashwick summary at his desk, read it twice and then stood up and walked to his window and looked at the city for a long time without speaking. Then he turned back to his desk and began issuing orders that had nothing to do with collection or surveillance or intelligence analysis. The orders he issued were the kind that his organization had not issued in 4 years, because the last time they had issued them the cost had been significant and the result had been contested. They were operational orders, deployment orders, the kind that moved people and equipment toward a target rather than around it. His senior staff received the orders and looked at each other across the table with the shared, unspoken awareness that something had changed this morning in a way that was not going to change back, and that the city outside their window was about to become a different kind of city than it had been yesterday. Calloway's deployment order reached his field commanders at 8:47 in the morning, and by 9:15, the first Meridian assets were moving through New Markov City in a configuration that anyone with operational experience would have recognized immediately as not a collection operation, and not a surveillance operation, and not any of the careful, deniable activities that organizations like Meridian conducted when they wanted to exert pressure without creating a record. It was a direct action configuration, multiple teams, converging routes, a command vehicle positioned at a distance that suggested Calloway himself intended to observe the outcome in real time. The objective, as transmitted to field commanders, was not to capture or contain. The objective was to remove the variable. Calloway had done the calculation that Hargrove had been avoiding since the footage first arrived on his desk. The calculation that said, if nobody controls this, and nobody can control this then, the only strategically rational response is elimination. And he had arrived at it faster than Hargrove because Calloway was not burdened by the specific hesitation of a man who had spent 45 minutes sitting across a table from Saitama and watching him drink coffee and found himself, despite every professional instinct he possessed, unable to think of the man across the table as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be spoken to. Hargrove received the alert from his street surveillance network at 9:22, which was 5 minutes after Meridian's teams had begun moving and approximately 40 minutes before they would reach the facility's perimeter. He called an immediate staff meeting and told his team, without extended preamble, that Meridian was inbound with a direct action configuration, and that the facility's defensive posture needed to go to maximum immediately. His security chief began issuing the relevant orders. Reyes, seated at the table with the specific stillness of someone trying very hard to appear normally concerned, rather than specifically and personally concerned, said nothing. Hargrove looked at the tactical display for a moment, and then said to the room generally that someone needed to tell Saitama what was happening. There was a brief pause, the kind that happens when a room full of professional people simultaneously processes the strangeness of a sentence, And then Keller, who had spent more time in Saitama's direct company than anyone else in the building, and who had developed, in that time, a pragmatic and clear-eyed understanding of what Saitama was and was not, said he would do it. Saitama was in the break room on the third floor, working his way through a bag of chips he had found in a vending machine, and watching a maintenance worker fix a leaking pipe under the sink, with the patient, interested attention he gave to any practical physical task being performed competently. Keller told him that a hostile organization was sending a significant number of armed people toward the building with the intention of killing him. He delivered this information as directly as he could, because in his brief experience with Saitama, directness produced better results than framing. Saitama listened, finished the chip he had been eating, and then asked Keller with genuine and unhurried curiosity why they wanted to kill him specifically, since as far as he could recall he hadn't done anything to this particular organization. Keller explained as concisely as he could that it wasn't personal, that Saitama's existence in the city had restructured the strategic calculations of multiple organizations simultaneously, and that from Meridian's perspective removing him was the rational response to an uncontrollable variable. Saitama considered this for a moment, and then said that it was a strange reason to try to kill someone, but that he supposed he had heard stranger. He stood up, folded the chip bag with the automatic tidiness of someone who prefers not to leave a mess, and asked Keller which direction they were coming from. Keller showed him the tactical display on his phone. Saitama looked at it, nodded once in the way someone nods when they've been given directions to a place they're not sure they'll find useful, and walked toward the stairwell that led to the building's roof access. Hargrove, watching the building's internal camera feed from the command room, saw him emerge onto the roof and stand at the edge, looking out over the city in the direction of Meridian's approach vectors with his hands in his pockets, and his posture carrying the particular quality of relaxed readiness that had no name in any tactical manual Hargrove had ever read because it had never existed before. Below the building, on 3 converging streets, Meridian's teams were 400 meters out and closing. In Calloway's command vehicle, a technician was tracking the facility's heat signatures and reported that one individual had moved to the roof. Calloway asked for a visual. The visual came back, and Calloway looked at the figure standing at the roof's edge and understood, with the sudden and complete clarity of a man whose calculation has just been revised by new information, that he had made an error somewhere. He could not yet identify where the error was. He would understand it more fully in approximately 90 seconds, when his lead team turned the corner onto the facility's street, and the figure on the roof stepped off the edge and dropped 4 stories to the pavement below, and landed without apparent incident, and looked up at the incoming team with the expression of someone who has arrived at an appointment slightly early and is content to wait. The team stopped moving. Every one of them, simultaneously, without an order being given, stopped moving. The stillness on the street lasted 4 seconds, which in a direct action operation is long enough to mean something has gone fundamentally wrong with the shared understanding that makes coordinated violence possible. Calloway's team lead, a man named Farrow who had run operations in 11 countries and who had the kind of combat experience that produces not fearlessness but a very precise and functional relationship with fear, broke the stillness by transmitting a single status check to Calloway's command vehicle. He said that the target was on the street, uninjured, and that he was requesting updated engagement guidance. Calloway looked at the feed from Farrow's helmet camera, which showed Saitama standing on the pavement in front of the facility entrance with his hands in his pockets, looking at the assembled team with the mild, appraising expression of someone evaluating a situation they have not yet decided requires their full attention. Calloway told Farrow to hold position, and then spent approximately 15 seconds doing something he almost never did in an operational context, which was thinking about whether the order he was about to give was the right order rather than simply the logical next order in the sequence he had already committed to. He gave the order anyway. He told Pharaoh to engage with full asset deployment, which meant everything. Every operator, every piece of equipment, every capability his teams had brought to this operation. He said it with the particular flatness of a man who has decided that uncertainty is not a reason to stop, which is sometimes true and was not true here. Pharaoh's teams engaged. What followed was later described by 3 separate surviving operators in 3 separate debrief sessions, in terms that were consistent enough across accounts to be reliable and specific enough in their details, to be genuinely difficult to read as a formal record. The engagement lasted slightly under 3 minutes. During those 3 minutes, Meridian deployed 23 operators, 2 armored support vehicles, 1 experimental directed energy emitter that had been in field testing for 8 months, and that its development team had classified as capable of incapacitating any known enhanced human target, and a shaped charge breaching system that Callaway had authorized for use against the building's structural supports as a secondary option if the primary engagement failed. The directed energy emitter fired twice. The first discharge struck Saitama directly in the chest and produced no visible effect beyond a brief pause during which he looked down at the point of impact with what several witnesses described as mild interest. The second discharge never completed because between the first and second firing Saitama had crossed the distance to the emitter, looked at it for a moment as if trying to understand its function, and then picked it up and set it down on its side with the careful, unhurried movement of someone relocating an object that is in the way. The operator responsible for the emitter was not harmed. He was simply no longer near his equipment. Saitama moved through the engagement the way he had moved through every engagement since arriving in New Markov City, which was without urgency, without visible effort, and without any of the aggression or momentum that normally characterizes a person moving through a space where people are actively trying to kill them. He was not attacking. He was redirecting, operators going down not from devastating strikes, but from the incidental force of a man moving at his own pace through a situation that could not slow him down, each contact brief and conclusive, and carrying the specific quality that everyone who experienced it described the same way, which was that it felt less like being hit and more like being informed, physically and completely, that the force you were applying was not registering in any meaningful way on the other end. By the time 3 minutes had elapsed, 21 of 23 operators were down. The remaining 2 had made the decision, independently and without communicating it to each other, to stop. They were not injured. They had simply reached the point where the professional calculus that keeps trained people moving forward in difficult situations had been overridden by something more fundamental, which was the direct, unambiguous physical experience of understanding that the thing in front of them was not something their training had prepared them for, and was not something that more effort would resolve. In the command vehicle, Callaway watched the feed from the 2 remaining helmet cameras, which showed Saitama standing in the middle of the street, surrounded by the evidence of a 3-minute operation that had consumed more combined combat capability than most small-scale military engagements, looking mildly inconvenienced in the specific way of someone who had been interrupted while doing nothing in particular, and was waiting to see if the interruption was finished. Callaway's communications officer told him that Dispatch was transmitting on an emergency channel, and that Director Hargrove was requesting direct contact. Callaway did not respond to Hargrove's request. He was looking at something else on the secondary feed, a data relay from his intelligence division that had arrived in the last 60 seconds, flagged urgent, containing intercepts from 2 other organizational networks that had been monitoring the engagement in real time. The intercepts indicated that both Ashwick Solutions and a 4th organization Callaway had not previously known was operating in New Markov City, had been watching the entire engagement from remote positions, and had already begun transmitting their own assessments outward to their respective networks. The assessment being transmitted was consistent across both sources and required no interpretation. It said that Meridian had committed its full operational capacity against a single target and had failed completely, and that the target was standing in the street, apparently waiting to see what happened next. What this meant, transmitted outward through the dense and interconnected intelligence networks of 4 organizations to the broader world of people who paid attention to such things, was that the strategic reality of New Markov City had just changed again, and this time the change was not a revision of assumptions. It was the end of a set of assumptions, and the beginning of something that nobody had a framework for yet, in a world that was about to need one urgently. Calloway gave his last order of the operation, which was to pull every remaining asset back to secondary positions and cease engagement. He said it quietly. Then he sat in the command vehicle for a long time, looking at the feed, watching Saitama pick up a piece of debris from the street, examine it briefly, and set it back down with the careful tidiness that seemed, increasingly, to be one of his most consistent characteristics. The footage left New Markov City the same way all consequential footage leaves contained situations, not through any single breach, not through any deliberate act of disclosure, but through the accumulated pressure of too many people with too many devices and too many competing interests all pointed at the same event simultaneously. By midday, fragments were already moving through private intelligence networks, with the velocity of information that everyone understands is significant before anyone has articulated why. By early afternoon, those fragments had reached the outer edges of the networks that connect private intelligence to the broader architecture of state-level monitoring, where analysts in 4 countries flagged the material and began the slow, institutional process of escalating it to people with the authority to decide what to do about it. By evening, it had crossed the threshold that separates classified awareness from public knowledge, not through any single leak, but through the mathematics of simultaneous exposure. Too many people knowing something for the knowing to stay contained, the information finding its way outward through the gaps between all the hands trying to hold it in. The first public fragment was 18 seconds of street-level footage, shot from a 3rd-floor window by a resident who had been watching the engagement from behind a curtain and who uploaded it without fully understanding what they had captured. It showed the final 90 seconds of Meridian's operation. It showed Saitama. By the time Hargrove's media containment team identified the upload and began the process of requesting its removal, it had been viewed enough times that removal was a formality rather than a solution. The public response moved through its predictable stages with unusual speed, because the footage was unusually clear, and the event it documented was unusually unambiguous. The first stage was the brief, collective pause of an audience that has seen something it does not immediately have a category for. The second stage was the rapid, competing proliferation of categories, theories, framings, contexts, each one an attempt to fit the footage into an existing understanding of what the world contained and how it worked. Government prototype, classified enhancement program, elaborate staging. The theories were not stupid. They were the theories that a reasonable person generates when confronted with something that should not exist within the framework of their understanding of what exists, and they served their psychological purpose, which is to create a temporary bridge between what you knew before and what you are being asked to incorporate now. The third stage, arriving faster than it usually did because the footage was simply too clear for the bridging theories to hold for long, was the stage where the theories began to fail, and the thing the footage actually showed began to be the thing people were talking about, which was a man absorbing the full offensive capability of a professional combat organization without injury, without effort, and without any visible change in his fundamental disposition, which remained throughout the footage, the disposition of someone mildly inconvenienced on an otherwise unremarkable day. Hargrove spent the afternoon in back-to-back calls with people above his operational level who had seen the footage and who were asking questions he had been asking himself for 2 days, and for which he had Vask's report as the closest thing to an answer, which was to say, not an answer so much as a precise and well-documented description of the absence of an answer. He told them what he knew. He told them what Vask had concluded. He told them, with the careful honesty of a man who understands that the moment to manage expectations has already passed, that there was no containment strategy available to them that had any reasonable probability of success, and that the question of what to do about Saitama could not be answered by any framework built on the assumption that he could be made to do or not do anything. The calls were difficult. The people on the other end of them were not accustomed to being told that a situation existed for which their organizations had no applicable response, and several of them said things that indicated they believed Hargrove was either being defeatist or was failing to think creatively enough about available options. Hargrove listened to these responses with the patience of a man who has already moved past the stage of the conversation his interlocutors are still in, and said, each time, that he understood their position and that he was open to any proposed approach they wanted to bring forward, and that he would evaluate it honestly. None of them brought forward an approach. They came back, each of them, to the same place Hargrove had already been, which was the place where you understand that the frameworks you have are not the right frameworks, and that building the right frameworks will take longer than the situation is going to wait. Saitama, who had returned to the dispatch facility after the engagement and had spent the afternoon watching a documentary about deep-sea fish on a monitor in the break room that someone had left running, became aware of the public attention in the early evening when Keller came in and showed him the footage on his phone. Saitama watched the 18 seconds of street-level footage with the same expression he had worn while being filmed, mild, present, not particularly invested. He asked Keller if this kind of thing was a problem. Keller said, with more honesty than was probably strategically advisable, that it was becoming one. Saitama nodded slowly, in the way he nodded when he was genuinely processing something rather than just acknowledging it, and then said that he hadn't meant to cause trouble, and that if there was a way to make things less complicated for the people involved he was generally willing to cooperate with that, though he wanted to be clear that he wasn't going to pretend to be something he wasn't, because, in his experience, that kind of thing tended to create more problems than it solved. Keller looked at him for a long moment and then said that he appreciated that and meant it, and went back to the command room to tell Hargrove what Saitama had said. Hargrove listened, and then was quiet for a while, and then said that tomorrow was going to be a very different kind of day than any of the days that had come before it. Outside, the city was loud with the specific, charged energy of a population that has just collectively understood that something has changed and has not yet decided how to feel about it. The change was real, and it was permanent, and it had a name, and the name was Saitama, and the world was just beginning to understand what that meant. The morning after the footage went public, Hargrove came to the break room before anyone else arrived and found Saitama already there, sitting at the table with a cup of instant coffee and a week-old newspaper he had found somewhere, reading the sports section with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has nowhere to be and has made peace with that. Hargrove sat down across from him without preamble, which was by now the only conversational mode that felt honest in Saitama's presence, and told him that the situation had moved beyond anything Dispatch could manage or contain, that 7 governments had made contact overnight requesting information, that 3 organizations had formally dissolved their new Markov City operations in the past 12 hours, and that the public conversation about what Saitama was and what his presence meant was now operating at a scale and velocity that no institutional response could redirect. He said all of this clearly and without editorializing, because Saitama deserved accurate information, and because Hargrove had understood, somewhere in the past 2 days, that the only genuinely useful thing he could offer this situation was honesty. Saitama listened to all of it, finished his coffee, and then said, with the plain and undefended candor that was his most consistent characteristic, that he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with any of that information, and that mostly he had been thinking about going home, because he had been away for several days now, and his apartment was probably accumulating a notable quantity of mail. Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. Then, because there was nothing else to say that would have been more useful or more true, he told Saitama that he was free to go, not as a strategic concession, not as a calculated release designed to manage optics or preserve leverage, simply as a statement of the actual situation, which was that Saitama had always been free to go, had been free to go from the first moment he walked into the facility, had been free to go from the first moment he arrived in New Markov City, and that the entire apparatus of surveillance and analysis and tactical response that Dispatch and Meridian and Ashwick Solutions had assembled around him over the past several days had been, at its foundation, an elaborate and expensive way of confirming what was apparent from the beginning, that freedom of movement was not something that could be granted to or withheld from Saitama by any external authority, because no external authority had any mechanism to enforce such a thing. Saitama nodded, stood up, rinsed his coffee cup in the sink with the automatic domestic tidiness that Keller had by now come to think of as his most human quality, and walked to the elevator. Hargrove stayed at the table. He heard the elevator open and close. He heard nothing after that which was appropriate, because Saitama's departure from any space had the quality of the space simply returning to its previous state, as if he had never disrupted it, though of course he had disrupted everything. The disruption did not end when he left. It had already traveled too far for his departure to contain it. The 7 governments that had contacted Hargrove overnight did not stop asking questions when Saitama walked out of the building. The 3 organizations that had dissolved their New Markov operations did not reconstitute them, because the strategic logic that had justified their operational structure had been invalidated and could not be reinstated by Saitama's absence, since the invalidation was not contingent on his location, but on the confirmed knowledge of his existence. Calloway, who had not slept, spent the morning on a series of calls with the people above him in the Meridian structure that went progressively worse as the morning advanced, because each call required him to say the same thing in a new way, which was that his organization had committed its full operational capacity to a direct engagement and had failed completely, and that there was no version of a revised strategy that addressed this failure, because the failure was not tactical. It was categorical. The category of response that worked against the thing they had engaged did not exist, and the resources Meridian had allocated to building and maintaining capabilities premised on the assumption that such a category existed were now liabilities rather than assets, because the world they were designed for no longer existed. Vask filed a final addendum to his report that afternoon, 9 pages long, which argued that the correct framework for understanding what Saitama represented was not a military framework or a threat assessment framework or a capability measurement framework, but something closer to a geological framework, the kind used to describe events that permanently alter the landscape rather than events that occur within it. He wrote that the strategic world that had existed before Saitama arrived in New Markov City was not recoverable, in the same way that a coastline altered by a significant geological event is not recoverable, not because the water has not receded, but because the shape of the land is different now and will remain different. The organizations built on the old landscape would adapt or would not, and the ones that adapted would do so by building on the new landscape rather than pretending the old one still existed beneath it. He submitted the report, went home, and slept for 14 hours. Saitama arrived back at his apartment in Z-City at 9:47 that evening, having taken 3 wrong trains and 1 correct bus and walked the last 12 minutes from the station. His mailbox was full. He took the mail upstairs, put it on the counter without opening it, made instant noodles and sat down on his couch and turned on the television. The news was showing footage he recognized. He watched it for a few minutes with the mild, slightly distant attention he gave most things, and then changed the channel to something about deep-sea fish, because he had seen the start of a documentary 2 days ago that he hadn't finished, and he had been thinking about it intermittently ever since. The world outside his apartment window was not the same world it had been a week ago. It was louder, more uncertain, organized around different fears and different questions than the ones it had been organized around before. It would take years to understand the full shape of what had changed, and some of what had changed would never be fully understood, and none of that was something Saitama was going to resolve by thinking about it on his couch. He finished his noodles. He watched his documentary. He went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept without difficulty, which was something he had always been good at, and which was, in its own quiet way, the most complete possible summary of everything that made him exactly what he was.